The morning they opened the ground along the Peshtigo River, the air smelled of pine sap and iron. A grey ribbon of mist hung low between the tamarack and the black spruce, and every shovel bite made a sound like a breath drawn in surprise. You'd never know, looking at that quiet water, that it had once carried people with their clothes on fire, that it had once hissed with steam when whole families rushed into it at once, that it had once spoken the other language of flame. Archaeologist Lila Morgan had grown up in Wisconsin, listening to a grandmother who could read weather like a ledger. The old woman used to say the Peshtigo fire of 1871 left more than stumps. It left a way of hearing the wind. Lila had carried that sentence in her spine, from graduate school to county surveys to this day. The day the county board had circled on their calendar in red as last day before substation work resumes. Biddies, the utility company, wanted a transformer yard where an old Halverson homestead had been, a rectangle of earth remembered only by tax maps and a lilac bush that refused to die. They'd already flagged the scatter, square nails, a bent spoon, a child's slate with a groove worn by a thumb that had long since become a story. 3 days earlier, they'd staked out the outline of a dugout cellar. The ground here was sandy, as if, 100 years ago, somebody had shaken a great blanket and let the grit fall where it wanted. That was part of why those fires had run so fast. Sand, wind, resin, and the wrong kind of dryness at the wrong time of year. That's a recipe, not a disaster. Disasters happen to you, recipes you make with your own hands. The crew worked quiet that morning, the way people do when their job brings them very close to where others used to sleep. Hector, the field tech, used his trowel as if he were buttering toast for a patient uncle. Myra, just out of school, bagged nail after nail with the tenderness of a librarian, making sure the right book ends up in the right hand. Lila kept one eye on the profile she was shaving, one eye on the sky that promised heat by noon, one ear on the road where a county truck idled impatiently, as if reminding everyone that time has its own budget. The shovel hit something that sounded wrong. Not a jar, not a rock. Something tight, like two kinds of time arguing. Lila knelt the way she always did before words and brushed back the grit. A smooth arc appeared, creamy as old soap, cranial vault. Human. All the practiced voices in her head stood up at once. Stop, document, call the liaison, slow the world down. She held up a hand, and Hector's shovel froze in midair, as if his arm had been drafted into guard duty. They pedestaled it. Lila called the county medical examiner, who knew them by name by now, and didn't even pretend he'd be there in less than an hour. They set up the tent fly not for rain, but for attention. Even butterflies respect a shaded room. The county guy riding herd on the substation plans came over and tried to look somber in a neon vest. "You'll keep me posted, Dr. Morgan," he said. And Lila said yes, without telling him what she was thinking, which was, "We're posting history, not your schedule." With the soil shaved down to a whisper, the skull gave itself up in increments. The mastoids, the zygomatic arch, the place where the fontanelle had once been a soft door for breath, and now was nothing but memory of softness. The teeth were small and even. The nasal bones had a lovely slope that made you think of a face that used to laugh. The right parietal had collapsed inward where heat had stolen strength from calcium. You see that in burn contexts, bone that shouldn't fold, folding. They found buttons within the scatter, 4-hole bone, 2 of them fused with a strip of iron that had once been an eyelet. They found a hairpin, the kind with a wavy spine, a relic of hands that had known how to wind a braid tight against a scalp. They found window glass, slumped and warped into tongues that had crawled and frozen in place when the air turned to oven. Lila had excavated plenty of burn layers, had worked a summer in Paradise, California after the campfire at the request of families who needed proof that their loved ones had been there. She knew the smell that heat leaves behind even years later, A sweet, sour edge that isn't rot or soot, but something the body invents when it has to be too hot for too long. She knew how to get quiet around that smell. The medical examiner, a man named Solomon Kay, with a mustache that tried to look older than his face, knelt in the dust beside her. "You've got a primary burial disturbed by fire behavior," he said softly, like a man commenting on the weather with a bow to the cloud that brought it. "Late 19th, he pointed with a pencil. "See the shrinkage of the long bones. But this collapse of the vault, that's a lot of heat." They worked together to ease the skull into a padded sling. Hector steadied the mandible with his fingers as tenderly as if he were keeping a stranger from speaking. Myra laid out the labelled bags. The crew did all the small reverences that make a dig a kind of church. When Lila lifted the skull into the light, something winked inside. Not the reflective sleep of bone, not the dull glint of a coin. Something like black-green glass nestled behind the inner table, a shard's curve where brain should have been and had long since not been. She froze. Everyone froze with her, as if a hawk had cast a shadow across their shoulders. "Do you see that?" Myra whispered. "Yeah," Lila said. Her voice surprised her by being steady. "I see it." Dr. Kay frowned, the way a man frowns when a melody lands on his tongue from a song he hasn't heard since he was a boy. He set the skull back gently in its cradle and angled it to the light. The thing inside caught the sun and sent it back not as sparkle, but as a narrow gleam, the kind you get off obsidian or bottle glass that's cooled too quick for the earth to argue with it. "Could be an intrusion," Hector said, volunteering a lifeline. "Cavity filled with melted window glass." "Maybe," Kay said, "but look at the interface. It's not sitting in there like a bead, it's adhered." He glanced at Lila. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I don't want to be," she said softly. He nodded. "Me neither." The radio at the edge of the site chirped. Somebody on the county channel wanted someone else to move a truck. The world kept being the world. Lila squinted toward the river, where the light on the water made a thread of white no thicker than a promise. She felt the weight of the skull in her hands and the weight of what it might mean in her chest. She thought of a paper she'd read years ago about Herculaneum, about a pyroclastic surge that had glassed a young man's brain into a brittle black glaze. She'd read it with awe then, with a kind of horrified wonder. It had felt like a story from elsewhere. The elsewhere had just moved in. The county rep cleared his throat. "So, does this change the plan?" Lila didn't look at him. "Everything changes the plan," she said. "That's what plans are for." They packed the skull. They bagged every shard of glass they could find, every nail with a curl of heat-drawn color at the tip, every bead of green that might have once been a window looking at the world. They documented, they mapped, they took photographs that would later be the only way to return to these few square yards when memory went thin. In the late afternoon, when the sky finally broke into the heat it had been promising all day, a woman arrived who walked like someone who had done a great deal of waiting and a great deal of deciding. She wore a denim jacket no matter the season, and carried under her arm a folded newspaper from long ago, its edges the color of tea. "I'm Ruth Halverson," she said to Lila. "My daddy said if they ever dug on this land, I should come see. He was 8 when the fire came. He said the house burned so fast the biscuits were still on the table." Lila told her what they had found, using the smallest true words. Ruth listened with her mouth small and her eyes wide open. When Lila said there had been something like glass inside the skull, Ruth pressed the newspaper to her chest. "People said the fire did things it shouldn't have known how to do," Ruth said. "They said sand turned to puddles. They said nails bowed like a man who finally heard the truth. My grandma used to say that fire had a plan." She caught herself and shook her head. "Fires don't have plans. People do. But you know what I mean." "I do," Lila said. They loaded the remains into the county van with all the solemnity the moment required and the county allowed. Dr. Kay promised to call as soon as he knew whether the glass was a trick of environment or a message from heat itself. That night, when the crickets took custody of the air and the river breathed fog up over the reeds, Lila sat in the motel with her notes and didn't write. She thought about the way the glass had clung to bone. She thought about the window panes that had once framed a morning and had later drooped like tongues and crawled like snails and then stopped forever because the cold had told them to. She thought about how the human head contains its own kind of window and what kind of night it might take to make that window look back. Across town, in a modest lab with a humming refrigerator and a single scanning electron microscope that every department treated like a good suit only worn on holidays, Dr. Maya Klein, a materials scientist who liked her coffee black and her data messy, checked her voicemail and listened to Dr. K's message twice. When she hung up, she put her hands flat on the bench and said out loud to the empty room, "No, no, no, yes." The trembling would come later. For now there was the business of method, chain of custody, temperatures, spectra. For now there was the business of looking at impossible things until they told you plain where they had come from. By morning, the lab smelled faintly of ethanol and toasted bagel. Comfort, in its way. Dr. Maya Klein had already set up the SEM and the Raman spectrometer, lined up her standards the way a choir director arranges voices, and taped a sticky note by the monitor that said, "No romance, only spectra." She knew herself well enough to put a leash on ore, when ore would be a trip hazard. Ore could come later in a parking lot when no one was looking. They unpacked the skull in a room so quiet that zipper sounds seemed rude. "Doctor." Kay passed plates of bone into gloved hands, as if he were lending out breakable things at a wake. Lila stood at the window, shoulders back in the stance she took when she meant to be useful and steady, and not in the way of the living or the dead. Hector and Myra hovered like people at the back of church who used to belong to this congregation and are seeing whether they still do. The object was not the size of a brain, not a grotesque glass casting like some macabre artist might make. It was a curved shard, smooth on one side, pitted on the other, with striations that ran like frozen ripples. Its color was a bottle green darkened to black, the way a forest looks from the middle. It clung even now to collars of inner bone where it had welded itself during a moment that had not been meant to be possible. "Sample first from the exposed edge," Maya said. "We're not going to destroy what we can read." She lifted a microflake from the margin with a tungsten needle, a gesture that felt indecently intimate and tender at the same time. Onto the stub, into the SEM. The screen bloomed with a terrain of bubbles, microvesicles caught in a matrix the machine wanted to call silica, but kept offering up carbon too, as if undecided in its loyalties. Beneath a certain magnification, it looked like lava. Beneath another, like ash. Beneath a third, it looked like structure, the kind you do not lightly name when you're in a room with a family somewhere waiting for an answer they did not ask for. Maya toggled to the energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy. Peaks rose. Psi. OC. A whisper of Na and Ka, the same elements you'd expect from window glass and bone. But the ratios felt wrong for a simple story. She wrote them down anyway, because wrong numbers are honest in their way. "Let's try Raman," she said. The laser hit the sample. The spectrum came back with the signature of amorphous silica, yes, but layered with bands that matched charred fatty acids, protein remnants, phosphates in a configuration that suggested biological origin not completely lost to heat. It was not pure glass, it was glass with memory. "Could be vitrified tissue," Maya said very carefully, the way you say "bridge out" when you're standing next to someone who insists the sign applies to other people. "Doctor," Kay exhaled slowly. "Say the rest," he murmured. "It means," Maya said, eyes on the screen, "that at some point conditions inside the cranial cavity reached temperatures high enough to melt silica from environmental sources, sand, window glass, soil quartz, and at the same time flash-heated the brain's lipids and proteins so fast they didn't have time to pyrolyze into ash. Then, just as fast, a rapid quench cooled the system, locking the mixture into a glassy state. We're talking temperatures in the 500 to 600 degrees C range or higher, with very rapid cooling, seconds, not minutes. That's rare, and grisly and beautiful and wrong all at once. Lila had read enough to know the parallel she didn't want to name first. Herculaneum, she said, very low. Maya nodded. There was that paper, she said, not looking up. A pyroclastic surge turned a man's brain to a vitreous glaze. The key was flash, not a long stew, a hit and a drop. Here we don't have a volcano, but we do have the Peshtigo fire, a firestorm with tornadic winds. Accounts talk about glass panes melting, sand fusing, iron doing a dance it had no right to. If the house had windows shatter and a gust push molten glass or silica-laden ash into the room where someone was already down, and then the structure collapsed, pulling in cool air and smothering flame, you could... She stopped, because the sentence would end with a person, not a concept. The room held its own breath. Science never happens neat. It happens with hands and people and someone's name on a newspaper in a descendant's lap. Can we date it? Lila asked, grateful for anything that wore numbers like armor. We can constrain it, Maya said. We can sample nearby window glass, see if the sodium-calcium silicate signature matches, and we can compare trace elements. We can look for pine resin markers in the matrix, if the burning pitch contributed. But the best date is in your trench. If the buttons, pins, nails all sing 19th century, and if the burial matches the homestead layer, the context is the clock. They worked the clock. Hector brought in flakes of window they'd collected from the north edge of the cellar, edges curled like a cat that found a patch of sun. Myra catalogued with the stern affection of a schoolteacher who allows no shortcuts and forgives every honest mistake. Maya ran spectra on each piece. The window shards sang Narcasio in a tight chorus with little iron and manganese, and just enough aluminum to tie them to a local sand source. The vitrified shard from the skull hummed the same melody, but with phosphates and lipid remnants laid like a counterpoint underneath. Dr. K laid the skull on a cradle of foam and looked at the inner table under a surgical microscope. The adherence was not incidental. The glass had flowed onto bone, wet against wet, and then set. The edge of the glass had captured a faint impression of the meningeal vessels, a fine branching no thicker than a hair. He felt the hair rise on his own arm, as if his body had recognized, before his mind did, the intimacy of heat's theft. "Is it possible," Myra asked, voice small and steady, "that neuronal structures are preserved?" Maya shook her head, but kindly. "Not neurons as neurons," she said. "Their architecture is too fine, and the chemistry is different. But patterns, vessels, maybe the capillary bed, the rippling of tissue in distress, that we can see. Enough to know this was a brain when it met glass. Enough to call it what it is. Vitrified cerebral material within an amorphous silica matrix. That's a mouthful. The short version is worse. Glass where flesh should be." They called Ruth. She came with a thermos of coffee and a composure that may have been borrowed from a lifetime of getting through winters. Lila explained. Maya showed the images they thought a person could survive seeing. They did not show the one that made Maya put a hand on the bench to steady herself. A thin lace of branching lines, frozen in the green-black, like a map of a city at night seen from far above. Ruth listened, eyes on the foam cradle, hands around her cup as if heat could be given and taken without cost. "So it was fast," she said finally. Not a long time. "As far as we can tell," Dr. K said. "Fast." Ruth nodded, and a single tear did that quick, efficient run from cheek to jaw that belongs to people who do not waste water, even on grief. "My dad used to say the fire roared like a train, only there wasn't a track afterward. I guess this is one of the tracks." The county board wanted to know if they could resume work by Friday. Lila told them no, with words that came out polite and landed heavy. She sent a note to the State Historical Society, knowing they'd say, "We can advise and we have a backlog, and we appreciate your stewardship," as if appreciation could be bottled and poured into holes where budgets used to be. She wrote to a colleague in forensic taphonomy who had accepted that jobs like this were a long conversation with heat and time. Maya wrote up a preliminary report in the language of science: amorphous phase, thermal gradient, quench rates, biogenic signatures. She kept her sentences cool on purpose. She did not write, "We trembled." She did not write, "It feels like looking straight at the instant when a person became an object." She did not write, "There are thresholds we know we shouldn't cross, and then life and physics push us across them anyway." When everyone had left for the day and the lab belonged to the hum of machines again, Maya stayed. She swiveled her chair toward the window and let her shoulders shake a little, because awe had waited its turn, and now insisted on being counted. She thought of her father, who had worked in a foundry and taught her without meaning to that glass is not a thing but a state, a way of being for matter that forgets, all at once, how to be a proper solid. She thought of the slumped windows that had run like tears, of sand turned to puddles, of buttons welded to nothing. She thought of brains, of their softness and their stubbornness, of the way they carry us through decades without cracking, and then sometimes, in a second, ask physics to do something impossible on their behalf. Lila went back to the river. She stood on the bank where the lilac refused to give up, where some descendant of the original bush had put down new feet in the ash and made itself a house where no boards dared. She thought of names, whose skull, whose hairpin, whose buttons had come up into the light. She thought of the substation, of the humming yard that would be built if the world insisted on forgetting its own syllabus. She thought of the old woman who had told her the Peshtigo fire left a way of hearing the wind. Behind her, Ruth came and stood without speaking. The way friends do when speaking is a way of making the world too small. After a minute, Ruth said, "When I was a girl, we'd go out in April and put our hands on the ground to feel the frost leaving. It makes a little sound if you're quiet, like sugar when it melts in tea." "I think I hear it," Lila said. "Good," Ruth said, "because we need to decide what to do with what you found." The question had been waiting in all of them: science, law, custom, heart. There would be meetings and memos. There would be people who wanted a display. There would be people who wanted a grave. There would be people who wanted the transformer yard to hum on by fall. There would be a choice between looking and looking away. And there would be, if they were careful, room for both truth and mercy. In the lab, under the sleepless eye of the microscope, the glass gleamed with a little line of light, where it curved to meet bone. That line doesn't move. But the meaning it throws off changes, hour by hour, as if told by the river itself. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday, because Tuesdays are what bureaucracies use when they don't want a thing to feel special. The county boardroom had the usual furnishings: a flag, a framed photograph of a past chair who had evidently believed that a good necktie could smooth out policy, a microphone that made timid people sound farther away and loud people sound angrier than they meant. Leela, Maya, and Dr. K took seats in a row like a jury that had agreed to be observed. The agenda item read, "Halverson Site Update." It could have read, "Which kind of respect will we choose?" The utility representative wore a suit that creaked at the shoulder seams when he folded his arms. He started with an appreciation statement that sounded like it had been polished by a person who writes appreciation statements for a living. "We value history," he said. "We also value electricity." Ruth sat near the back, a folded sweater on her lap even though the day was warm. She held herself with the exact grace described by Midwestern obituaries as no nonsense. When she caught Lila's eye, she lifted her chin a fraction, a motion that meant, "Tell it so they can hear it." Maya went first, because science in this century seems to need to speak before the human heart is allowed to. She kept her language plain. "We found glass inside a burned skull," she said. A murmur moved around the room like a low wind passing over rye, not alarmed, not indifferent. Testing shows it is amorphous silica bearing biogenic signatures, the remains of brain tissue preserved by vitrification during the Peshtigo fire. The circumstances required extreme heat, followed by rapid cooling. It is an extraordinarily rare phenomenon, but within the physics of what happened here in 1871. "Is it safe?" asked a board member who had the instinct to ask about safety, even when what he meant was comfort. "It's glass," Maya said, "stable at room temperature. It will not leak or anything else you might be fearing. The danger is in how we handle it, ethically." Lila spoke next about the context, the buttons, the hairpin, the window glass, the dugout. "This is not a crime scene," she said. "It is a historic burial intersected by a planned project. Our law asks us to treat human remains with dignity. Our practice asks us to treat descendants like partners." The utility man unfolded his arms. "We have a timetable," he said, a little too eager to sound firm. "The region needs this substation before winter. There are alternatives, but they're costly." Ruth stood then, untangling herself from the sweater as if stepping out of a past life. "I'm 81, she said. "My daddy showed me the stump where our house had been. He said, 'We lost wood. We didn't lose us. But we lose us when we pave over what it cost to be us.' I'm not asking for a shrine. I'm asking for a shift." "What kind of shift?" asked the chair, who had learned to make that question sound generous. "Move your transformer 200 feet, Ruth said. "You can. I know because I saw the early plan before somebody shaved the margin. Leave the lilac. Leave a space for a stone. Let the glass go back to the person it came from, with a copy in the museum so kids can learn without peeking into what should be a private place." The room went as quiet as a hunting field in snow. You can say a lot, but when someone says private about the inside of a head, the sentence sits differently. The museum director, who had kept her counsel until then, spoke up. "We can make a cast and preserve the data, the scans, the spectra, for study. We don't need to keep the object to learn from it. We have a better story to tell if we also tell the story of return." The utility man did the math of reputation in his head and decided the expense line would be cheaper than the headlines. "We can look at the shift," he said. Maya, who could read male subtext in 4 dialects, heard yes, with conditions. It would do. There was more. There is always more. Permits. Paperwork. A letter from the state expressing both commendation and warning. A grandmother who cornered Lila in the grocery store aisle later that week and told her about a time when she herself had found a button in a field and kept it for a year and then put it back with an apology because it had made her feel watched. People feel watched when bones come up. It's not superstition. It's the body recognizing the body. The reburial happened on a low Sunday after the lilac had decided to be green, when the earth takes its first easy breath after winter, and even the stubborn stones soften a little. They didn't make a show, no cameras, no speech beyond what decency requires. Dr. K carried the skull the way you carry a baby when you don't want to wake it. Maya set the cast, a resin replica with the black-green shape intact, on a white cloth that made it look more terrible and more tender by contrast, and then put the cloth back in its box because the day wasn't for teaching, it was for doing. Ruth placed a small tin box in the grave with what she said was a scrap of her father's notebook and a button she had found when she was 9, and returned when she was 10, and had borrowed again just for this day, because she wanted the dead person to have a choice about whether to give it back later. Lila wanted to object to the archaeology of that act, and found she could not. There are rules, and there are tiny rebellions that make rules worth having. They set the glass, wrapped in linen labeled in the plain hand of someone who has written too many tags, into the space where a head belongs. Lila felt a tremor in her throat that had nothing to do with tears. Maya's hands actually shook, and she didn't hide it. "It's not the science," she said later in the parking lot. "It's the nearness." After, they stood around the lilac in the way people stand around after a funeral when they are relieved to still have bodies. They talked about ordinary things: apricot jam, a good plumber, the way the bridge ices early on the first freeze. The utility man came and shook hands awkwardly, as if both were too expensive. He promised flags and a rerouted plan, and the sort of interpretive plaque that attempts to tell the truth without claiming it. Lila told him where the plaque should not go. It would not go on the grave. It would not go on the lilac. It would stand near the transformer, making that hum earn its keep. In the months that followed, Maya presented the case at a conference, and because she is who she is, the slide with the glass and its micro-branching came second, not first. First came the method. First came the reminder that temperature and time are not just numbers, they're manners. She said vitrification in a room full of people who think they have heard everything and watch their faces become children again for a flicker. She chose her last slide with care, a photo of a lilac with a scrap of winter still tucked in the crotch of a branch, green insisting in its blind way. Lila wrote a piece for the local paper at Ruth's request, a column that didn't dramatize so much as name softly. She wrote, "We found glass where a person's thinking once sat. We didn't put it on a shelf, we put it back in the earth, and we kept the learning. This is how we can be both curious and kind." Ruth took to sitting on a small bench near the rerouted fence, where she could see the transformer yard and the lilac both, letting the two hums, electric and floral, argue quietly in the air. School kids came sometimes with a teacher who didn't over-explain. They asked questions that belonged to children and to science. Did it hurt? How hot does it have to be? Can glass remember? Ruth would say, "It hurts to think about. It hurts less if you do something with the hurting. Very hot. And glass remembers the moment it became glass, if you know how to read it." One afternoon, Myra came by with a box of seedlings and a grin that belonged to the kind of spring you can smell. "I got permission," she said. "Wild phlox along the fence. Shade-loving won't fight the lilac." Ruth took one and tucked it into the earth with the same brisk mercy she used on everything. "Stay," she told it, because she had learned the right size of prayer. At the museum, the cast sat in a small case with no drama, just a sentence about heat and time and care. The label said, "Replica, original interred at the Halverson site with descendant consent." People paused longer at that second sentence than at the first. Maya liked to stand off to the side on days when she could escape and watch faces go through their motions. Surprise, discomfort, understanding, a kind of plain gratitude that the world still contained adults. Children pointed. Adults read. The world progressed a millimeter in the right direction. Sometimes, when the river kept its fog low and the transformer hummed a chord that you could mistake for a sigh if you were tired, Lila would stand at the lilac and think not about glass, but about mercies. Mercy in physics, that there is a way for matter to change fast, and for us to learn from that without having to keep it in a drawer. Mercy in law, that paper can be made to bend around a life. Mercy in people, that an 81-year-old woman can say no in a room and be heard by men who measure days in invoices. She would picture, because the mind is a screen that insists on playing what it wants, the moment the green-black thing inside that skull had formed, not as a horror but as a fact. Heat applied, tissue transformed, silica poured and set, a window made inside a window. Then she would put that picture away on purpose, the way you put away a knife when company is over. Because there is knowledge that wants to be used, and knowledge that wants to be stored in a place, without edges. "What did you find?" people ask her still, at backyard barbecues and in line at the DMV, and in the long quiet of winter church. She can answer a dozen ways and does, depending on who is asking. "We found proof of a firestorm's physics." Or, "We found a rare thing that changes how we see the oldest American fire." Or, when the person is old and holding their own sweater, "We found a way to do right by somebody whose name we may never know." If she's at the bench with Ruth, the answer is shorter. "We found glass," she'll say. Not flesh, but it held something of her. Ruth will nod. The transformer will hum. The lilac will remember its job. And the river will carry its quiet past, both of them, translating, as it always has, between the two languages of flame, the one that burns wood and the one that burns meaning into whatever is left.